The Rhine lay under a ceiling of fog and gun smoke on the night of March 23, 1945. For centuries, the river had marked the spine of Europe. Now it was a front line, quiet for the moment, but full of pressure, like the air before a storm. On the western bank, Allied lines stretched in silence. Trucks had stopped moving. Searchlights were shuttered. Orders had gone down hours earlier. No coughing engines, no clanking gear. Every soldier knew what awaited across the water. Nobody wanted to be the one to disturb the sheet of quiet that lay over the river. The Rhine moved slowly, swollen with snowmelt, its current heavy and unforgiving. On the opposite bank, German positions traced the floodplain, trenches carved into frozen soil, machine gun nests, dug deep, bunkers hidden behind skeletal trees. The defenders called it their last wall. Inside one of those bunkers, Feldwebel Ernst Rauch sat with his boots still wet from patrol. He had crossed the trench line an hour earlier and heard something unsettling. Nothing. For weeks, Allied artillery had boomed like a drumbeat. Now, there was only wind. That silence worried him more than any barrage. German command believed they understood the Allied playbook. A river this wide would take days of bridging, armor buildup, and noise. Rauch's unit had rehearsed their counterfire for months. When the crossing came, they expected time to adjust fire, call artillery reserves, and strike the bridging columns before they grew strong. They didn't know that across the river, thousands of Allied soldiers were already in position, hidden in darkness, crouched in mud, engines cut, oars wrapped in cloth. Trucks had delivered boats under camouflage nets. Field guns were zeroed to the meter. Major William Harrison, standing behind a low embankment near Wessel, checked his luminous watch, 2150. Everything was on schedule. Behind him, rows of amphibious trucks waited like silent animals. He had drilled his men for weeks, not to shoot faster, but to launch without being heard. The first noise they hear, he'd told them, will be the end of their defense. The moon was a thin shard, perfect for concealment. A fine mist clung to the water, masking movement but chilling the men to the bone. One British sergeant pressed a hand against the steel flank of his vehicle, drawing warmth. He could feel the river beyond, the breath of a current ready to swallow or carry them. To the east, German artillery observers scanned through soot-blackened binoculars. They saw nothing. They heard nothing. But some of them felt it, a low hum carried through the soil, the vibration of thousands of troops holding their breath. At 22:10, a coded signal ran through the Allied positions. Stand by. Men tightened straps, checked their rifles by touch alone. Oars slid into the water without a splash. German machine gunners shifted uneasily. Rumors had reached them of boats with wheels. Nonsense, they thought. No vehicle crossed a river this wide without a bridge. They didn't yet know the river was about to become a road. In a farmhouse cellar behind the German line, Oberleutnant Heinrich Müller traced expected crossing zones on a map. His division was under strength. Half the manpower needed to hold the sector. Reinforcements were promised but never came. Fuel was scarce. The Luftwaffe was silent. He had seen the Red Army cross rivers like this on the Vistula. He felt no certainty. Back on the western bank, Harrison walked the line for the last time. Men whispered short sentences, jokes without laughter. Some wrote quick notes and slid them into breast pockets, just in case. War planners in London called this a crossing operation. For the men kneeling in the mud, it felt like stepping into the unknown. The air changed just before midnight. It always does before artillery. There's a silence that isn't silence. A pulling back of the world. Even the birds vanished from the riverbank. A single flare arced high and fizzled behind cloud cover. Across the German positions, officers moved along the line. Radio chatter grew busy. The defenders didn't know where the blow would fall, only that it would. Their doctrine promised them a fight measured in hours, not minutes. On the western bank, Harrison raised a hand. A ripple passed through the shadows. Engines coughed once and caught, muffled under tarps. Canvas peeled back from the strange machines that would carry them across. The river waited, the night stretched thin. It was March 23rd, the last night the Rhine would stand as Germany's shield. In the winter of 1945, the Rhine was more than a river in German military planning. It was a wall, a natural fortress older than the Reich itself. Commanders drew their defensive lines on maps with the same certainty one traces the edge of stone. Every kilometer of water was supposed to buy time, and time was the only currency Germany still believed it could spend. Orders circulated down the Wehrmacht chain of command. The Rhine will hold. Bridges were rigged for demolition, approaches mined, firing arcs plotted to the meter. Artillery observers memorized the riverbank's curves as if it were scripture. This wasn't just a defensive line, it was treated as destiny. The assumption began at the top. Staff officers, veterans of two fronts, believed no modern army could cross a river of this scale without first building extensive bridging. That would mean delays, engineering buildup, and above all, visibility. They imagined an enemy they could see coming. The doctrine was clean, logical, even elegant. Enemy bridging columns would be caught in the open, pontoons shredded by artillery, vehicles bogged in floodplains. Reserve units would counterattack at pre-designated zones. Machine gun nests along the bank would have the luxury of hours, even days, to break the assault apart. But what they imagined was a war that no longer existed. By early 1945, the German army was fighting with the shadow of its former self. Divisions were skeletal, fuel scarce, experienced NCOs replaced by boys. Even the vaunted Panzer formations were often just names on paper. Yet the staff clung to the idea that the river itself would compensate for everything they lacked. It would slow the Allies. It would let overstretched formations breathe. It would act as a natural ally. Propaganda amplified the myth. Radio broadcasts called the Rhine the eternal boundary, the line no foreign army had crossed since Napoleon. Civilians were told it would stop the invaders. Soldiers were told the same, only with steel in the voice. In bunkers along the river, officers read those bulletins by candlelight. They rarely believed them fully, but belief wasn't the point. It was rhythm. It kept morale upright in a war everyone knew was being lost. To question the Rhine was to admit the end was coming. Oberleutnant Heinrich Müller understood this myth more clearly than most. A veteran of both fronts, he'd fought through snow, mud, and Soviet encirclements. He'd learned that rivers don't stop modern armies, men and machines do. But in March 1945, there were too few men, too few machines, and the sky belonged entirely to the enemy. His division held a sector with barely half its authorized strength. Anti-aircraft guns lacked fuel. Artillery had more firing orders than shells, and yet the maps still showed thick black arrows, as if paper reinforcements could fight real battles. The German command structure believed in time delays. If the Allies crossed, they expected hours to redirect artillery and bring in reserves. That assumption shaped everything. Trench placement, minefields, radio nets. What they could not imagine was a crossing, executed like an assembly line, silent buildup, precision bombardment, amphibious vehicles replacing bridges, an assault completed before reinforcements could even leave their depots. The myth of the Rhine's impregnability was both doctrine and psychological lifeline. Soldiers repeated it like a prayer. They had to. No one wanted to admit what would happen if the river failed them. In the final briefings before the assault, regional commanders still used confident language. "The river gives us breathing room," one report declared. "We can hold the West Bank for weeks, perhaps longer." But the intelligence reports, arriving on the same desks, told a different story. Allied truck columns stretched beyond the horizon. Air superiority was absolute. Radar-directed artillery could silence batteries before their third shot. The staff knew this, but they still clung to the fortress image. Strategy, in the end, is as much about belief as reality. By the eve of March 23rd, the Rhine line was a fragile idea disguised as a wall. To the soldiers, it was the last shield. To their commanders, a delaying tactic dressed up as destiny. And to the Allies, who had spent weeks preparing to cross silently and strike in a single, synchronized blow, it was just the next obstacle to erase. The DUKW did not roar. It hummed. It crept down to the water like a machine that knew its purpose too well to boast about it. To most civilians who had seen it during training demonstrations, it looked almost comical. A truck with a boat's body, wheels tucked beneath its hull. But to the engineers who designed it, and to the soldiers who would ride it across the Rhine, it was something far more profound, a way to make geography irrelevant. The war had produced its share of powerful weapons, tanks, rocket artillery, jet aircraft. But the DUKW was not born to destroy. It was born to move. Its origin traced back to American designers in 1942, tasked with building something that could carry men and supplies from ship to shore without waiting for a pier or a bridge. The answer was a six-wheeled amphibious truck that could swim. It could carry 2.5 tons, handle waves, roll up a beach, and keep going inland without stopping to refit. It had no glamour, but it worked. On paper, its design was simple: a watertight hull driven by a propeller in water and wheels on land. A transfer case allowed the driver to shift between propeller and axle in seconds. The hull's shape, long and sleek, kept it stable in current. A bilge pump handled seepage. The driver could adjust tire pressure on the move, giving it traction on mud, sand, or cobblestones. But simplicity is deceptive. It is the product of engineering that knows exactly what it wants to do. When the Allies planned to cross the Rhine, they didn't want another bloody bridgehead operation like at Remagen. They wanted movement, constant, unstoppable, rhythmic. The DUKW was perfect for that. Unlike pontoon bridges, it didn't need setup time. Unlike boats, it didn't need to be unloaded and abandoned on the far bank. It was a machine that turned water into a road. In the staging areas behind the Rhine, hundreds of DUKWs stood in neat, silent lines. Their olive paint absorbed moonlight. They had been modified for the crossing: extra fuel drums, waterproofed radios, sandbags to balance load. Mechanics worked without light, hands guided by memory. Every one of these trucks was expected to cross multiple times that night. Men first, supplies after, artillery if needed. To the men assigned to them, the vehicles felt oddly alive. Corporal Thomas Red Wallace, a driver from Ohio, had spent months training on lakes and rivers. He could feel the machine's weight shift as it entered the water, the subtle roll of current against the hull. "It doesn't fight the river," he told a friend. "It slides through it." The Germans didn't believe in a machine like this. Their doctrine revolved around bridges. They assumed no army could land heavy equipment without first building one. They didn't realize that the DUKW rendered that assumption obsolete. Every single DUKW was a self-contained bridgehead. It didn't wait. It didn't ask for terrain. It simply went. Behind the front lines, logistics officers mapped routes down to minutes. One column of DUKWs would carry infantry. Another, mortar crews. Another, ammunition. As soon as the first wave landed, the same vehicles would turn around and bring the next load. It wasn't glamorous work. It was relentless. The machine's strength wasn't its armor or firepower. It had neither. Its strength was tempo. A DUKW in water traveled faster than a pontoon could be deployed. A DUKW convoy could shift positions without warning. If a landing zone came under fire, they could simply land somewhere else. That mobility was invisible to most observers. Newspapers loved tanks and planes. Few wrote about amphibious trucks, but the staff officers who ran the war understood. Every successful operation rests on movement, the ability to bring men and supplies faster than the enemy can react. The DUKW turned that principle into steel. Harrison's unit received their DUKWs months earlier. They trained in freezing rain, in mud, in darkness. They practiced launches without lights, landings under fire, recovery from near capsizes. They learned to trust the machine's stability more than their own legs. By the time they reached the Rhine, it was no longer technology. It was instinct. The DUKW also carried something intangible: confidence. Soldiers stepping into those vehicles did not feel like they were climbing into fragile boats. They felt like they were climbing into a plan that worked, that mattered more than any gun. Müller and his fellow officers had never faced a logistics system like this. They were used to pauses between river crossing and advance. They counted on them. Those pauses gave defenders time to react, to redirect fire, to bring reserves. The DUKW erased those pauses. The moment the Allies crossed, they would already be moving inland. Every feature of the DUKW served that purpose. Its propeller allowed it to slip silently into the water. Its hull rode low, making it a difficult artillery target. Its capacity meant it could ferry platoons in minutes. It was cheap, mass-producible, and, most importantly, it worked in the dark. In the tactical map rooms, Allied officers didn't talk about the Rhine as an obstacle. They talked about throughput. Tons of men and material per hour. That was the language of an army that thought like a machine. And the DUKW was the perfect cog. Wallace would later describe the moment his vehicle first touched the Rhine. It felt, he said, like driving straight into a cloud. He couldn't see 10 meters ahead. The fog hugged the water, swallowing sound. But the engine didn't hesitate. It rolled down the bank and slid forward, exactly as drilled. He adjusted throttle. The hull lifted. The river accepted the machine. This wasn't just a clever invention. It was the beginning of a new kind of war, one where the river didn't matter, where natural barriers no longer belonged to defenders. On the far bank, men like Müller waited for bridges to build themselves. On the west, men like Wallace were already crossing without one. The Rhine front looked deceptively still in the week before the crossing. German observers peered through fog and binoculars, waiting for the noise that would give the enemy away. It never came. The Allies weren't massing like a conventional army. They were disappearing into the landscape. Convoys moved at night with headlights blacked out. Supply dumps appeared in barns, basements, and hollowed-out railway stations. Thousands of tons of material, ammunition, fuel, bridging gear, rations, radios, flowed toward the front without ever forming a visible column. Engineers worked in silence, draping camouflage nets over roads, riverbanks, and marshes. To the German reconnaissance planes that occasionally slipped through Allied air cover, the terrain looked unchanged. This wasn't luck, it was design. The Allies had spent months mastering the choreography of concealment. They understood that surprise was no longer about what the enemy saw, but about when they understood what they were seeing. Every piece of the buildup had a timetable. Trucks carrying assault boats reached their dispersal zones at night and vanished by morning. Units rehearsed embarkation drills miles from the river, then marched back to their billets before dawn. Amphibious vehicles like the DUKW were parked in farmyards and behind haystacks. Their engines run only long enough to keep them ready. On German maps, Allied strength along the river was estimated in broad strokes. Their analysts saw only scattered signals, a few bridging units here, a spike in radio chatter there. It was data without a pattern. The Allies made sure of that. They fed those patterns with deliberate misdirection: false construction sites upstream, dummy boats, mock gun positions. Harrison's engineers had turned deception into muscle memory. Even fuel drums were stacked in irregular shapes to avoid aerial detection. Ammunition crates were stored under layers of straw. A riverbank that seemed empty during the day could transform overnight into a launch zone capable of supporting thousands of men. The fog helped, so did discipline. Every man knew the price of noise. Cigarettes were shielded, tools wrapped in cloth, boots padded. If a single convoy had blundered into the open, German artillery could have shredded the staging areas. But nothing blundered. This wasn't the chaotic buildup of Normandy in 1944. This was something colder and quieter. An operation designed to be invisible until it was too late to stop. Müller's unit across the river felt the unease but couldn't name it. Patrols reported hearing distant engine vibrations at night, but they found nothing in daylight. Phantoms, one officer called them. Yet the veterans knew better. Armies do not vanish for no reason. Inside Allied command posts, timing was everything. Commanders spoke in minutes, not days. The crossing force had to arrive at the banks fully assembled without alerting the enemy, a logistical trick that bordered on impossible. But the Allied machine thrived on precision. Every truck movement, every artillery calibration, every fuel barrel had its slot in a clockwork schedule. Harrison walked the length of the staging area 2 nights before the attack. The riverbank was empty at sunset. By midnight, it was alive with shadows, men kneeling beside trucks, engineers checking mooring lines, signal operators whispering into field sets. No flares, no lanterns, no raised voices. The quiet was a weapon sharper than steel. Across the river, Müller watched the mist roll in and out. He'd been ordered to conserve ammunition. His gunners grew restless in their emplacements. The high command kept assuring them that they'd have time to react when the Allies finally moved. Müller wasn't so sure. Something about the stillness felt wrong. On the night of March 22nd, German sentries reported flashes upriver. Commanders dismissed them as probing fire. In reality, they were calibration rounds. Allied artillery mapping the river's contours, plotting where their shells would fall when the real storm began. By dawn, the mist returned. The river looked the same. The defenses looked the same. Only the clock had changed. The buildup remained invisible until it no longer needed to be, and by then, it wouldn't matter. The river waited in silence for weeks, and then, in a single instant, the world split open. At 23:30 hours on March 23, 1945, every Allied gun along the Wesel sector fired at once. The night turned to light. Fog lit up like glass struck by lightning. Sound hit the riverbanks like a physical blow, slamming through trees, trenches, and lungs. Men on both sides felt it, not just in their ears, but in their bones. For the Germans, it came with no warning. Their doctrine told them they'd have time. They didn't. The first salvos landed deep behind the river line, communications hubs, command bunkers, and artillery batteries. The second wave walked forward in perfect sequence, closer and closer to the banks, until the entire shoreline was a storm of steel. Harrison felt the ground jump beneath his boots as the guns behind him opened up. Hundreds of artillery pieces, American, British, Canadian, fired in a rolling curtain designed not to break through, but to saturate. Their firing data had been refined for weeks. Each round had a purpose. There was no random shelling tonight. For Müller, crouched in a dugout that suddenly felt far too shallow, the storm was overwhelming. He'd survived artillery before, but never like this. It wasn't chaos. It was precision. Bunker roofs cracked like eggshells. Telephone lines vanished in the first minutes. Machine gun crews clawed at headsets filled with static. Orders couldn't travel. Positions could barely hold their shape. The German soldiers' faith in the river was not broken by a single shell. It was eroded by the unrelenting rhythm. A salvo every second. Another, another, like a hammer on stone. Artillery officers along the Allied bank monitored their watches with clinical focus. At 23:50, fire shifted in pre-programmed blocks, lifting just enough to let the crossing units move. By then, the defenders were buried in smoke, confusion, and the psychological weight of knowing the worst hadn't even begun yet. On the West Bank, DUKWs and assault boats rolled toward the waterline under cover of the barrage. Their engines were still muffled. Men jogged in crouched columns, faces smeared black, boots sinking into river mud. The sound of the guns drowned out everything. Orders, fear, even the river itself. German forward observers tried to call for counter-battery fire. Nothing answered. The artillery net was shattered. The bridges behind them were already under fire. When one observer raised his head above the trench lip, the horizon was a single line of flame and thunder. Harrison climbed into his assigned DUKW. He had crossed rivers before. But this was different. This wasn't about inching over in chaos. This was about moving through a machine built for this one moment. The artillery was his shield, timed to the second. At midnight, Allied fire shifted forward once more. A thin gap opened between the final barrage zone and the riverbank. That was the window. The first wave of amphibious trucks rolled down the muddy slope and slid into the Rhine. The fog swallowed them instantly. Only the ripples and faint engine vibrations hinted that an army was entering the water. Wallace tightened his grip on the wheel, the way he'd done in training. To his right, another DUKW slid silently past. Its bow light was masked, its wake soft. It was like entering a storm's eye. On the German bank, Müller pushed out of his bunker and stumbled into a world he no longer recognized. His trench line was gone, flattened, twisted. Trees were splintered into matchsticks. His machine gun crews were disoriented, their ears ringing, their firing arcs blind. They'd trained to repel bridging units, not ghost convoys moving beneath the cover of fire and fog. Some German artillery batteries tried to fire back. A few shells landed near the river, kicking up geysers, but Allied counter-battery was instant and lethal. Within minutes, the guns were silent again. The crossing units advanced as the barrage rolled ahead of them. It was like following a wall of thunder that never stopped moving. DUKWs glided between landing points, their drivers guided by compasses, training, and a memory of the map more than sight. As Harrison's DUKW neared midstream, the artillery's flash illuminated the river in bursts. He caught glimpses, other trucks moving in parallel columns, soldiers crouched low, faces like shadows. The river didn't feel like a barrier anymore. It felt like a highway. On the far bank, Müller's men tried to regroup, but the barrage made coordination impossible. Officers shouted orders no one could hear. Flanking fire positions never came online. Reserves sat stalled kilometers away, pinned under the same storm. The final artillery lifts were scheduled down to the minute. At 0:15, the guns would lengthen their range to cover the inland approaches, leaving the landing zones smothered but open for assault. The river, in that moment, belonged entirely to the Allies. For years, the Rhine had been a line on every German map, a wall in the national psyche. But in 45 minutes of continuous, flawless bombardment, that line had turned into a door. When Harrison felt the bow of his DUKW grind softly onto the east bank, he didn't cheer, he just nodded to the man next to him. They stepped out into smoke and chaos that belonged entirely to them. The Rhine was supposed to be a wall. Instead, it became a road. By 0:30 on March 24th, the first wave of DUKWs had touched the eastern bank. The artillery storm still thundered inland, carving a shield of sound and steel. The river itself, dark, cold, and restless, was now a silent artery feeding the assault. The transformation was instantaneous. What had been an obstacle minutes earlier became a supply line. DUKWs landed, dropped their loads, and without pause, turned back into the current. Empty trucks slid past full ones, heading in. The fog swallowed them all. Harrison jogged up from the riverbank, mud clinging to his boots, rifle slung low. The landing zone had no drama, just movement. Men disembarking in disciplined silence, setting up perimeter arcs, checking compasses, no shouting, no heroics. It was a machine made of people. On the water, the rhythm was relentless. Each DUKW carried a platoon or several tons of equipment. Within the first hour, hundreds of tons were already across. This was the real breakthrough, not a single dramatic bridgehead, but thousands of tiny ones, arriving every few minutes like a tide that never receded. German defenses had prepared for a predictable sequence: bridging, delay, counterattack. They got something else entirely. By the time forward observers confirmed the scale of the crossing, the Allied presence on the east bank had already grown too large to dislodge. Muller tried to move a reserve platoon toward the landing zone. They never reached it. Allied artillery had anticipated the routes. Shells bracketed every road leading to the river. Trucks burned quietly in ditches. Men scattered into the fog. Across the Rhine, Wallace reversed his DUKW and let the current help him swing around. The vehicle responded like a creature that knew its environment. He'd done the maneuver 100 times in training. Now, it mattered. Dozens of others followed the same arc, engines synchronized by discipline more than design. The Germans couldn't see how many were crossing. The fog made a handful of DUKWs look like a fleet. Their artillery tried to fire blind into the mist, but counter-battery fire silenced them again and again. What had been a carefully mapped defensive line was unraveling without a proper battle. By 1:30, engineers on the West Bank began assembling ferry points and laying foundations for bridges, not because they were needed to win the night. They were for what came after. The river had already ceased to be an obstacle. On the East Bank, Allied infantry advanced cautiously but steadily. They moved inland, not as scattered raiders, but as organized elements with immediate resupply at their backs. Ammunition, mortars, radios, all ferried in without delay. Harrison's unit linked up with another wave at a road junction, 2 kilometers from the landing site. Their orders were simple: secure the approaches, widen the beachhead, keep the flow unbroken. No grand speeches, just momentum. Muller crouched behind a collapsed trench, watching the fog roll over ground he'd once marked as impassable. His men were firing, but the sound felt thin against the artillery's rumble. There were no clear targets, only movement in the mist. He realized with a soldier's cold clarity that this was no longer a fight for the river. It was a fight for time, and time had already slipped away. Back on the water, Wallace completed his second crossing. He could no longer see the far bank behind him, just the soft glow of covered headlights, shapes moving like ghosts. The river traffic was now constant. It sounded like nothing and everything at once. Engines, water, boots, breath. The German command structure was fracturing. Radio nets overlapped, jammed, or fell silent. Officers issued counterattack orders that never reached their units. Reserve battalions, meant to move hours later, were already under air and artillery strikes. By 3 o'clock, a corridor of movement stretched from the western shore to several kilometers inland. Allied divisions didn't stop at the riverbank. They flowed through it. A private in Harrison Sipp's unit would later write, "We didn't set storm the river. We just crossed it, like it wasn't set even there." The psychological impact was brutal. German strongpoints, designed to resist frontal bridging assaults, were bypassed entirely. Isolated machine gun crews fired into empty fog, not realizing the enemy was already behind them. When the first bridge sections arrived at dawn, they were no longer critical to success. They were simply reinforcement. The battle for the Rhine had already been decided hours earlier, by trucks in the dark, moving like water. Müller finally ordered a withdrawal from the forward trench line. It wasn't a retreat so much as a collapse inward. He had no artillery, no reserves, and no river left to defend. The Rhine, once their fortress, had been conquered not by overwhelming fire alone, but by pace. The soldiers on the riverbank felt only their own piece of the fight: mud, fog, steel. But behind them, far from the sound of the guns, an entire machine had been turning for months to make this night inevitable. The Rhine crossing was not a single operation. It was the visible edge of a logistical system built with industrial precision. Every artillery barrage, every amphibious vehicle, every engineer and truck was part of a vast engine designed to erase obstacles through sheer rhythm. By early 1945, Allied command no longer treated rivers as unique strategic barriers. They treated them as nodes in a supply network. Planning for the Rhine began long before the men reached its banks. It started in depots hundreds of kilometers away, where factories ran day and night to feed the invasion front. There were no improvisations here, only sequences. Artillery shells arrived in the correct order, already crated for specific batteries. Bridging pontoons were pre-numbered to slot together without debate. DUKWs were assigned to fixed circuits, like cogs on a conveyor belt. The war machine didn't rely on brilliance. It relied on throughput. Harrison had seen it firsthand in England before the Normandy landings, but on the Rhine, the system reached its purest form. Columns of trucks rolled like clockwork, guided by military police waving dim lights through the night. Fuel convoys ran to the minute. If one truck failed, another filled its slot. The men were soldiers. The system was a factory. On the German side, Müller's experience was the opposite. He commanded men, not systems. His army relied on terrain and discipline, not endless material, where the Allies had spare engines. The Germans had shortages, where the Allies replaced damaged guns within hours. The Germans waited for days, if replacements came at all. And the river amplified that difference. Allied planners calculated the Rhine crossing in tons per hour, not divisions per day. Every W cabin ship represented an equation: X soldiers, Y equipment, Z turnaround time. By dawn, their flow rate exceeded 1,000 tons per hour in some sectors. This wasn't a battle, it was logistics made visible. The river became a conveyor belt. As trucks returned, they carried back the wounded and empty crates. Nothing moved without purpose. Even the artillery that softened the German bank was tied to the logistics spine. Each round fired had already been replaced before it left the barrel. This scale wasn't accidental. Allied industrial capacity dwarfed anything the German army could match in 1945, but scale alone didn't win. Precision did. Coordination turned quantity into something sharper than any weapon. At 4 o'clock, Harrison's unit received a fresh wave of supplies before the fog even lifted. Ammunition stacks were already sorted, food rations pre-labeled, spare radio batteries counted. They weren't waiting for trucks. The trucks were waiting for them. German commanders couldn't comprehend the speed. They expected time between crossing and exploitation, a gap to counterattack. That gap didn't exist. The Allied machine erased it by turning river crossing into a continuous movement, not a discrete event. In a staff bunker, Müller listened to fragmented radio reports. "They're already inland. We have no reserves." Artillery positions lost contact. Each voice came from a unit fighting in isolation. He understood what it meant. The defenders weren't facing an army. They were facing a process. The Allies no longer needed breakthroughs in the traditional sense. Behind the front, train depots emptied on schedule. Fuel moved through flexible pipelines. Spare parts arrived before they were requested. Engineers weren't reacting to problems. They were executing a flow chart. This was modern war at its coldest and most decisive. The DUKW, That unglamorous amphibious truck was simply the most visible part of the machine. Its quiet engines carried the proof of an entire industrial base in motion. Every trip across the Rhine was backed by assembly lines, logistics planners, and an empire of steel. By sunrise, the crossing points had expanded into structured ferry terminals. Shore parties controlled traffic like harbor masters. Ferry schedules were logged, stamped, timed. What had started as a night assault was now a full-scale riverine highway system. The Germans never had a chance to match that. Even their most disciplined counterattacks found themselves facing an enemy that didn't pause. You can fight soldiers. It's much harder to fight a machine that never stops. Müller would later reflect in captivity that the artillery didn't break them and the DUKWs didn't surprise them. What truly crushed the defense was the speed at which the river disappeared as an obstacle. The machine behind the men was invisible that night, but it decided everything. The German defense didn't collapse like a wall under a single blow. It cracked like ice under pressure. Everywhere at once, in the first hour after the artillery barrage began, discipline held. Officers shouted orders, gun crews returned fire, and forward observers tried to see through the fog. But by the second hour, cracks appeared. Communications failed. Units lost contact. No one knew where the front began or ended anymore, because the front had stopped being a line. Feldwebel Ernst Rauch had trained to see war coming in clear shapes. Waves of infantry, bridgeheads, predictable chaos. On the Rhine, he saw only fog and shadows. Shells fell behind him and in front of him. Engine noises came from everywhere and nowhere. The river that was supposed to protect him now gave the enemy cover. Panic never begins with screaming. It starts with silence. When the next trench doesn't answer the radio, when the artillery net goes dead, when the sound of friendly guns disappears. German soldiers along the Rhine didn't break because they were cowards. They broke because the shape of the world they'd trained to defend dissolved in front of them. The doctrine they believed in promised clarity. Hold the river, destroy bridges, wait for reserves. None of that happened. There were no bridges to hit. The counterattacks never formed. The river, meant to be their ally, had become a highway for the enemy. Oberleutnant Heinrich Müller saw belief slip from his men's faces. It wasn't dramatic. No one threw down their rifles. It was in the way they stopped asking questions. The radio emitted only static. The machine gun nest he had placed on the rise was silent. Patrols sent to the shoreline never returned. Every minute, the Allied advance changed faster than the defense could react. That was what shattered them. German units began firing at shadows. Some retreated to fallback positions that didn't exist anymore. Others dug in and waited for orders that would never arrive. The assault didn't feel like an attack. It felt like drowning. On the Rhine, the Allied movement didn't look like an army. It felt like weather, fog, noise, and a current of trucks sliding silently through the water. To the defenders, it seemed endless. Rumors raced through the trenches. They seep already behind us. They seep landed everywhere. Once whispers like that take hold, no command can stop them. By dawn, the riverbank was a landscape of disbelief. Reserve units that were supposed to counterattack no longer existed as coherent formations. Men wandered between shell craters looking for orders. Some simply walked away, not in formal retreat, but in stunned drift. Rauch found himself alone near what had been his gun pit. The trench was gone. Mud, fog, and silence pressed in. On the ridge, he saw Allied soldiers advancing, not in a chaotic rush, but in slow, unbothered confidence. It wasn't speed that broke him. It was inevitability. He had fought in Poland, seen brutal waves of men and tanks. This was different. It felt precise, quiet, final. He dropped his weapon, not because he feared dying, but because there was no one left to fight with him. Müller tried to salvage a fragment of command. He gathered a dozen soldiers in a ruined farmhouse. Their faces were hollow. The map on the table no longer matched the world outside. The fallback line was gone. The artillery grid meant nothing. Orders were relics of a battle that no longer existed. He issued commands anyway. Hold the road, delay them. But the words were meaningless. Holding a road didn't matter when the enemy was already everywhere. Outside, the Rhine, their supposed shield, was filled with Allied vehicles crossing as if the river were a paved bridge. Psychological collapse isn't loud. It isn't men running in panic. It's a glance between soldiers who know the plan is gone. A radio operator who stops trying. A sergeant who stares at the fog and lowers his rifle. German command would later blame fatigue, artillery, numbers. But the truth was simpler. They had built their will on the idea of a fortress that didn't exist. When that illusion broke, everything followed. By midday, scattered resistance remained. Some fought, some surrendered. But the battle had been lost hours earlier, not by guns alone, but by the erosion of belief. One captured corporal said simply, "We waited for the river to save us. It never did." That sentence explained the fall of the Rhine more clearly than any report. When dawn burned through the fog on March 24, 1945, the map of the Western Front was already obsolete. The Rhine, the river German propaganda had called the last wall, was behind the Allies. Armored columns were already moving inland. What was supposed to be a drawn-out siege had become a clean break in a single night. The crossing didn't just defeat a defense line, it broke a strategic hinge. German high command expected to buy time. A major river, in their doctrine, forced a pause. They built their counterattack plans on that pause. It never came. DUKWs and ferries had created a rolling highway before sunrise. By the time German reserve orders were drafted, the front had already moved east. For Harrison's battalion, the moment barely registered as a turning point. Orders were simple: move, secure, hold nothing back. Infantry advanced inland, while artillery leapfrogged to pre-planned fire zones. Supply lines followed the water like a shadow. The Ruhr lay ahead, Germany's industrial heart. The road was open. At German headquarters, the first reports were fragmented. Units spoke of fog, confusion, overwhelming artillery. Then the radios went silent. Counterattack timetables, drafted weeks earlier, were meaningless against an enemy already inland. The crossing's true power wasn't measured in kilometers gained, but in time stolen. A river expected to hold for days had been erased in hours. Every German formation west of the Ruhr now faced encirclement before they could reposition. The psychological aftershocks spread even faster than the tactical ones. For months, the Rhine had been used in speeches and broadcasts as a symbol, proof that the homeland was still defensible. When it fell so quickly, that illusion cracked. Co-commanders who had endured the collapse of France in 1944 and the Ardennes defeat in winter now understood. There would be no line after this one. The Rhine had been the last story they could tell themselves about delaying the inevitable. The Allies, sensing the opening, acted with mechanical precision. They didn't stop to consolidate. Bridges were assembled even as armored divisions pushed east. Air support shifted inland, bombing road junctions to choke German movement. Supply columns crossed the river without interruption. The Rhine, once a frontier, was now a logistics artery. For Müller and other frontline officers, the speed of events was disorienting. When he reported to divisional headquarters on the morning of the 24th, the command post was already preparing to withdraw. Counterattack plans sat on tables like props from a play whose audience had gone home. His unit was ordered to regroup east of the Ruhr. The phrasing carried an unspoken truth. The Rhine was already lost. In Berlin, reports of the breach reached the highest levels before noon. Some officials dismissed them as exaggerated. Others demanded reserves that no longer existed. Luftwaffe units had no fuel. Armored divisions were fragmented. The once feared German machine had no muscle left to counterstrike. What made the crossing strategically devastating wasn't just its speed. It was the absence of friction. Every step the Germans expected to slow the Allies. Bridging delays, vulnerable buildup phases, artillery duels never happened. The crossing bypassed their playbook entirely. Allied planners capitalized without hesitation. The operation that had been expected to take several days accelerated into a rolling offensive. Within 48 hours, Allied armored columns were deep in the Rub Basin. German resistance continued, but the center of gravity had shifted. This was no longer about holding lines. It was about surviving collapse. Müller saw it on the roads eastward. Streams of retreating soldiers mixed with civilians, smashed trucks, broken artillery. No one spoke of counterattack anymore. They spoke of getting out before the encirclement closed. The Rhine, which had once been a symbol of German security, was now a symbol of its exhaustion. Historians would later write that the Rhine crossing didn't just shorten the war. It ended the possibility of any meaningful German strategic maneuver. With the Ruhr exposed, the Reich lost its last industrial shield. The end became a countdown. Harrison Sepp's after-action report didn't use the word shockwave, but his description captured it. We crossed, we moved, and nothing slowed us down. History often remembers the spectacular, the tank charge, the paratrooper drop, the general's speech. But sometimes, victory moves quietly on wheels. The DUKW was never designed to be heroic. It was a truck that could float, a piece of engineering born from necessity, not glory. It lacked the sleek menace of a fighter plane or the brute presence of a tank. And yet, in March 1945, it became the hinge on which the fall of the Rhine turned. The crossing was not about singular moments of courage. Though there were many, it was about uninterrupted movement. Amphibious trucks ferried men and material across one of Europe's most storied rivers, while artillery and fog shielded their advance. Where older wars would have stalled for bridges, this one flowed. For Harrison, the DUKW was just a vehicle. He didn't think of legacy. He thought of the wheel's vibration beneath his boots, the river spray on his face, the silent roll down the bank. He thought of the way hundreds of them seemed to appear from nowhere, merging into a single, unstoppable rhythm. For Müller, the same vehicles represented something far larger, the shattering of a belief. His defense had been built on the river, but these trucks didn't respect the river. They ignored it. They made centuries of strategy irrelevant in a night. Historians would later call the Rhine crossing a textbook example of modern operational warfare. But that phrase misses something. It wasn't a textbook then. It was an innovation in real time. The DUKW was a symbol of a new kind of power, not just military power, but industrial momentum. A nation that could build and coordinate thousands of such machines could rewrite the rules of terrain. Geography became negotiable. After the war, the image of tanks rolling across Europe dominated public memory. But buried in photographs and after-action reports was the real engine of movement. Unarmed amphibious trucks ferrying artillery shells, fuel, radios, and men who would never make headlines. The DUKW didn't win the battle alone, but it enabled it in a way no heroic charge ever could. The Germans had built their defense around rivers as barriers, a concept that had held true for centuries. The Rhine had stopped armies since Roman times. In 1945, it lasted a single night. The psychological impact went beyond Germany. Every military planner in the world took note. Fixed defenses were obsolete against mobility and industrial-scale logistics. In the decades that followed, military engineering absorbed this lesson. Rivers became tactical features, not strategic shields. Amphibious vehicles evolved, bridging techniques accelerated, and entire doctrines shifted from holding ground to maintaining tempo. The Rhine wasn't the end of rivers in war. It was the end of rivers as walls. Harrison returned home a year after the war ended. The DUKW he'd driven across the Rhine had long been scrapped or repurposed, but the idea behind it, the quiet power of movement, echoed through every campaign that came after. For Müller, the river crossing became a wound that never fully closed. In captivity, he spoke of it not as a defeat, but as a disappearance. The river was there at night. By morning, it was gone. That was the power of the machine, not just to destroy, but to erase the enemy's sense of what was solid. The DUKW itself faded from public imagination over time. Museums displayed a few of them, usually in corners behind bigger, louder artifacts. Tourists walked past without realizing they were looking at the backbone of an operation that helped end a war. But among those who study logistics, the quiet art of making armies move, the DUKW remains a symbol, not of heroism, but of inevitability. War is rarely won by the loudest machine. It's won by the one that moves longest and fastest. The Rhine crossing didn't just open a river. It opened the Ruhr. It accelerated the fall of a regime that had ruled through terror and war. It shortened the suffering of millions. And it proved something fundamental about modern warfare. The future belongs to the side that can turn terrain into throughput. In March 1945, a river that had shaped centuries of European history became, for one night, just another road. That is the legacy of a swimming truck.